Port Republic, the last battle of Jackson's 1862 Valley Campaign. You are standing on the coaling. By the Civil War, this area was nearly devoid of trees, the timber having been used for the production of charcoal. This was the key Federal artillery position during the Battle of Port Republic. Federal Commander Brigadier General Erastus Tyler stretched his 3,000 infantry and 3 batteries of the artillery in a line from a spur of the Blue Ridge. Mountains on your left, along the coaling, then 3/4 of a mile to your right to the south fork of the Shenandoah River. It would prove a strong position. On the early morning of June 9th, 1862, Confederate Major General Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson, victorious the day before at Cross Keys, attacked the Federal line. His leading unit, the famous Stonewall Brigade, was easily repulsed 2 times by galling fire of musketry and canister. Following this reserve, the Federals on your right counterattacked, pushing the Confederates back nearly a half mile. At this point, Jackson's position was precarious. Fortunately for him, fresh Confederate units were now approaching the field.
Every battlefield has its places that have memorable names. Gettysburg has?
Pickett's Charge. Yeah. Joshua Chamberlain. No, that's not a place.
Places. Culp's Hill, the railroad cut, right? Antietam, Dunkard Church, Burnside's Bridge, Sunken Road. At Port Republic, we have the coaling. The Lewiston family and his farm behind us here, behind me, you're looking at it. They owned a lot of acreage here, and up on this hill they had a chimney where they made coal, charcoal, for use in the smithy. You can't imagine how much ironwork had to be done by a farm of that magnitude. They owned all of the land from here to the river, which is maybe a mile away. Port Republic, we just came from it. What do you think that is? 3-4 miles away? So the plains that we're going to be crossing here follow the south fork of the Shenandoah. Follow the Shenandoah. The high ground across the river comes into play after the fight here. But this coaling, if you just stand where you are and look out there, if those trees weren't there, if just the farmhouse sat there, what a view you would have of rows of advancing Confederate infantry. So up on top of the coaling, we have a number of guns, okay? These guns are decimating the Stonewall Brigade, who have been fed in by Jackson. Pogue has some artillery pieces, a Confederate named Pogue. He has to actually separate his cannons because from this position they're too easy a target. So he has 2 guns that advance with the infantry across the fields. But as the Stonewall Brigade is advancing, half of them are still on the other side of the river in that bottleneck and that traffic jam we described earlier. They finally all get across, and in rides Richard Ewell to save the day. Remember at Gettysburg, Robert E. Lee says, take that hill if practicable, right? Didn't turn out so well. Ewell decided it wasn't practicable, and the rest is only subject to another what-if conjecture. Here, Ewell takes 2 infantry brigades, the 2nd and the 4th Virginia, under command of a man named Scott. And those men are told to go over the shoulder of that hill over here, come through that gap behind us, and come storming out of the trees to the coaling up behind us near the yellow house. As they come through, they expect it's going to be a surprise assault. Guess what? Somebody pulled the trigger too soon. And so the Yankees up here knew they were coming. And as the rebels swept up through this gap here, up onto the coaling itself, they're met by blasts of canister. These men here too are protected by infantry. What are you going to do? The Virginians have failed, and Ewell has to trace his steps back to Jackson's position closer to Port Republic. Who's coming up now? More of Ewell's troops. Who are the shock troops? The Louisiana Brigade, only one of which were actually called the Tigers early in the war. The Tigers with the 1st Louisiana Special Battalion. Read special however you want, but like I said, they were wharf rats, they were dock rats. The story goes some of them had a choice of staying in prison or joining the regiment. So, you are tasty. You are getting, the best New Orleans has to offer here, right?
Yeah.
Well, eventually, the entire brigade takes the nom de plume, the Tigers, but it was the 6th Louisiana, the 7th Louisiana, and they are led by Richard Taylor and no less than Jedediah Hotchkiss himself up over that slope again. And they come roaring through the trees 3 times, and they are blasted back by canister and by musketry. They reform, they come back again. They're blasted back. On the 3rd assault, because these are the Tigers, they don't know when to quit. They got amongst the guns. The infantry has either been killed or has retreated, and so the cannoneers are fighting up here with their rammers, with their sponges, and the Tigers come in among them with their Bowie knives. The story goes that Robideau Wheat himself and a guy named Peck, both of who were like 300 pounders of muscle, which was very unusual in that day, were stalking among the artillery horses, slitting their throats so the guns could not be pulled off the coaling. When the guns were finally captured, they were turned on the Union troops in Lewiston Lane, except they were no longer there. They had seen the Stonewall Brigade was breaking, and they were attacking to push the Confederates back and secure this battleground as a Union victory, when lo and behold, the coaling is no longer in the hands of Federal gunners. It's now in command of troops wearing the gray or the funky striped trousers. And they start firing into that Union assault. At that same moment, more Confederates have come across the river. The Union troops break and they head back in that direction. And the fight here is basically over. But remember, it was 6,000 Confederates, basically, against 3,000 Union. And the Union could well have held this point forever with the ground they had, especially with the guns up here in the coaling. Okay, that's the story of the Battle of Port Republic. The casualties I have listed in your book. I'd like to go to that because that leads in the final thing I want to say. Many times we say, these battles like, oh, Port Republic, what's it all about? Cross Keys, what's it all about? At Cross Keys, there were 17,300 engaged with 11,500 Federal against 5,800 Confederate. But of those, 1,500 left, the Louisiana Brigade, which was pulled partway back to that church and held in reserve, as Jackson was trying to decide if the threat at Port Republic, that raid, was a real threat or not. So they were out of the fight for a big part of the time. The casualties at Cross Keys were 684 for the Union and 288 for the Confederates. What is that? That doesn't even bear mention, does it? It's almost more a skirmish than a battle, some might say. Here at Port Republic, we had 9,500 engaged, 3,500 or so Confederates to about 6,000 Federal. Casualties, 1,002 for the Union and 816 for the Confederates, most of them out on the plain behind us. Union casualties probably occurred up here in the coaling, but when Tyler's men went across the field to drive the Southern troops back. So why is it important? Why does this campaign even matter? This is the crown jewel of Jackson's career, in my opinion. Simply because he accomplished 3 main things. First of all, remember talking about the famous General Banks or the famous General James Shields. And it's like, who ever heard of these guys? But we've all heard of Jackson. We've all heard of Ewell. And so one thing that happened here is these men made a name for themselves, and the invincibility of Jackson and his men has a real kickoff and send-off here. You've got your foot cavalry, right? These men did the impossible for Jackson. So that's number one. Secondly, the valley here, which was the breadbasket of the Confederacy that Tom will be telling us about later, survives for 2 more years. For 2 more years, this breadbasket supplies food to the Confederate Army, but beyond that, Every little smithy in the valley, every leather shop is making leather goods for the Army, is preparing some iron type work for the Confederate Army. So 2 more years. So out of this valley we had 2 very important things, and the third being, if the morale of the Confederacy is lifted, what happened to the morale of the Union? 50,000 troops never got to leave Washington, D.C. to join McClellan outside of Richmond. And of course, McClellan says to Lincoln he could have won there if he received the support of Washington. Plus the 30-some thousand troops that were coming down on both sides of Massanutten Mountain, those 2 columns that were trying to trap and smash Jackson in a pincers movement. By Jackson's brilliance at Port Republic with the burning of the bridge, never got to connect, and he defeated them separately in detail. So the battle ends. It's in the hands of the Confederacy. There are wounded men all over the field here, and finally Fremont arrives on the field. He's across the river on the high ground where the Hess's house is, in that area, and in his anger and bitterness, he unlimbers his cannons and starts firing into the wounded on the plains below him. So not only was Fremont questionable as a general, he made questionable decisions as a human being. So we have the Battle of Cross Keys and Port Republic. What are the 3 reasons this campaign is important, that it ended here? Can somebody summarize the first one for me?
Well, it saved the valley.
That's the second one. Save the valley, the breadbasket, and they're not in any order. So Tom, let's put that for number 1. Okay. Save the valley, the breadbasket, the ironworks, the leatheries. You know, there's a tannery here, right? So the valley is still in Confederate hands, and it's often described as a dagger pointed right at the heart of Washington, D.C., because that's the way the valley runs. Second reason the campaign was important, Dave?
Wasn't this a battle in the north? Am I that far off?
You are that far off. No, it did not. I can't take what you're saying and make it work. Rich.
Gave Jackson and Ewell some invincibility to his troops against the Union.
What had been going on in 1862? He said gave Jackson his troops a sense of invincibility. What happened before this in 1862? Little thing called Shiloh, right? The Confederacy, Donelson, has had reverse after reverse after reverse. And so whether this campaign scenes of the magnitude of an Antietam or a Gettysburg, what it did for the morale of the Confederacy is either fortunate or unfortunate. It allowed the Confederacy to survive for a few more years. They might have been on their ropes in 1862, except for what happened here. That is highly significant. And the third thing, Carmen?
No, I got a question for you.
Third thing.
Well, it took the pressure off of Richmond, tied up all those soldiers here in the valley.
Tied up a big chunk of the soldiers McClellan was counting on, because, you know, he was very, very outnumbered on the peninsula, right? And by the grace of God, he escaped by the skin of his teeth, even though he outnumbered the rebels, and even though many of the fortresses he thought he was assaulting were filled with fake earthworks and Quaker guns. And Quaker guns are logs painted to look like cannons. So if we have spoken ill about McClellan before this, I'm not going to apologize. I think Fremont gave him a run for his money. Carmen, your question.
I am still not, I don't mean to be the wet blanket here, but I am still not hearing what the strategic value of this plot of land was. I know what the consequences were, that it kept the valley open for the Confederates. I'm hearing all of that. I'm hearing that it kept 50,000 troops from heading to Richmond. I get all that. Why did these 2 armies meet here?
They met here because the Union was trying to trap and crush Jackson. So strategically, they're trying to destroy an entire Confederate army and take the Shenandoah Valley out of the war on behalf of the Confederacy. So the strategic value would have been, the military value would have been to crush an army and plug up the valley, which was, like I said, aimed at like a dagger at the heart of D.C. So it was going to take away an avenue of invasion.
Got it.
How's that sound?
Got it.
Port Republic itself didn't matter, except just like Gettysburg, as a crossroads town. This crossroads town was actually a river crossroads, wasn't it? how all these rivers came together, formed the Shenandoah. And transportation matters. Did we mention, or if you read the signage back in Port Republic, that they had those gondolas? Yeah. That was on the videotape last night. That was a highway when the water was higher.
They went all the way to Harper's Ferry.
All the way to Harper's Ferry.
Far away. Yeah.
Other questions? Otherwise, the bugs are starting to get me. Rich Callen.
I only have one comment. This whole campaign was only 2.5 months in '62.
Yes, sir.
So it wasn't like they were here for years. I mean, 2.5 months. So it wasn't that long of an operation.
Repeat the question. No, can you repeat his question?
His comment was that this was only 2.5 months long, and so therefore they weren't here forever. But the effects on the valley, because we're going to be done with 1862 now, ultimately leads into 1864, when all the bad stuff happens in the valley. It is going to be brutal. It's going to be awful. You hear the term total warfare. I don't believe that that is correct here. I think as we learned at the Milwaukee Civil War Roundtable, the better term is hard war. And hard war is also taking the war to the civilians and destroying the breadbasket. Terry.
I just have one comment about
One comment.
the lasting effect of Jackson's Valley campaign. Officers today still study this campaign because of Jackson's genius and the way he used the internal lines, you know, to get there first with the most men, and he just did that so brilliantly. So they still bring staff rise down from West Point and the Army War College, and they study this campaign. Erwin Rommel, one of the greatest generals of the Second World War, studied Jackson's Valley campaign and learned from him as well. So the effects, you know, the influence has just been huge throughout history.
So Terry's comment was that the lasting effects of this campaign lasted into the 19th, 20th, 21st century, as military people still study what Jackson did here, how he used the ground. Even Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, the great general of World War II, studied this battle. And if you know anything about Rommel, you might not be too far off saying he was a modern day Jackson, the way he uses panzers in his Africa Corps. I'd like to close with a telegram sent from Port Republic, received at Richmond on June 17th, 1862, near Port Republic, via Staunton. Through God's blessings, the enemy near Port Republic was this day routed with the loss of 6 pieces of his artillery. T.J. Jackson, Major General commanding. And that's the word Richmond got, that instead of begging the whole army, Jackson's whole army, as Fremont and Banks and even Irvin McDowell thought they would do, they were instead routed by troops that were about half their number. Again, that's why the battle's studied so much. Questions yet?
Yep.
Otherwise?
Was that church here possibly in 1862 and possibly that farmhouse over there?
The farmhouse behind us is called Lewiston, after the Lewis family. It was here. The church to our right is a post-war structure.
Okay, thank
to
you.
my right.
Port Republic Battlefield, here, June 9th, 1862. General T.J. Stonewall Jackson defeated General J. Shields' vanguard, advancing from Elkton under General R.O. Tyler. Federals engaged 4,500, killed, wounded, and missing 556,000, killed and wounded 804.